call this meeting in order at 7:04. Great. Okay, welcome everybody. First thing we have tonight is the public comment. I have one public comment from Tom Mooney on 5205 Pheasant Run, McFarland. I understand the painstaking responsibility of McFarland School Board pertaining to reopening the schools in the future. Whenever and however you make the decision to reopen the schools for in-class learning, regardless of the model you approve, I encourage board members and all administrators to spend a day in a classroom to gain firsthand knowledge and experience what students will be expected to do when they return to in-class learning. As adults, we shouldn't expect our children or any child to do something that we wouldn't be willing to do ourselves. It would be beneficial if decision makers take the time to experience the restricted physical movement to social distancing to guarded socialization to fearing the experience restricted physical movement to the social distancing to guard. Did I do that wrong? God darn it, I'm gonna jump the line.
Why don't you start with, it would be beneficial.
It would be beneficial if decision makers take the time to experience restricted physical movement to social distancing to guarded socialization to fearing the prospect of contracting COVID-19 to wearing a mask all day to other changes expected of children in the class learning. Let's also remember the multiple restrictions required before in-class learning is restarted. The social emotional rationale for reopening the schools may not be possible due to those same restrictions. Tom Mooney, McFarland. Thank you, Tom. And fall planning update.
Okay, thank you very much, Arlen. I'm joined tonight by Brooke Hauser, and we're going to focus this evening on our fall update and especially focusing on 4K. So let me get my screen shared here. Okay, so we are going to follow up on last week's very lengthy report on all of the details that we're putting in place for grades K-12 with a report on 4K. As I mentioned last week and the preceding several meetings, 4K falls under different guidelines than K-12. 4K is under child care guidelines, whereas K-12 falls under the school rules for public health, and they're slightly different. And so we have some different options ahead of us for 4K that we don't necessarily have with K-12. And so tonight we're going to talk about those things. We're going to begin this evening though with a public health update, and then we'll get into the 4K updates, and then just a couple short pieces, some no earlier than dates for transitioning to step 3, the hybrid model. And I'll talk more about these as we get later in the presentation, but we've had a number of folks in the community and also for internal planning expressed that having at least some type of a no earlier than date would be extremely helpful for planning purposes. So we're gonna talk about those a little bit, and then the last piece is going to be some clarification on staff expectations for step 2, and step 2 is, of course, is the virtual learning piece. So. Jumping into public health, these are the Dane County cumulative data as of this morning. Over 4,500 confirmed cases of COVID in Dane County, nearly 200,000 tests, 299 hospitalizations total, and sadly 38 deaths due to COVID-19 in Dane County. The cumulative case count, the piece that we look at here is the slope. Early on in the COVID situation, the slope was fairly flat, indicating that the cases were not increasing at as fast as a rate as they began to later in the summer. So this steeper part of the curve indicates a very fast increase in cases per day. And that's one of the metrics we look at to kind of paint the overall picture. What the other slide here that we've been looking at is the new case data, both cases per day, which are the columns, and then the 7-day average, which is this blue line that traces through the columns here. And what we'll notice is from a peak in the late June, obviously every day the total count is different, but when you look from late June to this week's data, which are reflective of the end of last week, it's not a straight line in terms of a pattern of decline, but it is a trend on the whole, a trend heading down. So we'll be looking for, when we get to discussing criteria for moving from step 2 into step 3, one of the criteria we're looking for is a 14-day steady trend of declining data, declining 14-day or 7-day average. We want to see that for 2 weeks straight, and then we would be looking at the possibility of moving on to the next step. This afternoon, Dane County Public Health released their updated forward Dane metrics, and I want to talk about 2 additional points that I have not included in the previous couple of weeks, but are important to mention. The percent positive tests is actually in the green area here, and that is for having a threshold below 5% for positive tests as a percent of the total test average across the most recent 14-day period. So that's a positive. We're seeing a low percentage of positive tests. Cases per day are still high. That still comes out in the red category on public health data. There's a positive change here in lab reporting timeliness and contact tracing. For the last 2 weeks, this was red, and as of this afternoon at 5 o'clock, this has improved to yellow, which means we're seeing some progress in the lab reporting timeliness and contact tracing, which is a description of the public health department's ability to isolate positive cases, run contact tracing, and hopefully prevent further spread of the disease. Community spread is still red in the Dane County metrics, and community spread again is the percentage of positive results of COVID to which the source cannot be identified. So we are seeing some encouraging signs, but still quite a ways to go here in this community spread metric, and then cases per day as well. I mentioned this last time, but the implications of the public health data are the virus is going to remain a challenge for us until there's a vaccine and or therapeutic treatments. We have to be very diligent with cleaning and disinfecting, and teaching preventative behaviors is very important. And all students and staff, and frankly, our community members, are vulnerable to the virus. And so I just want to thank everybody for their efforts in following all those procedures and things, and also encourage everybody to keep doing that. So just as a reminder, our framework for reopening schools is a 5-step plan, beginning with step 1, where it's just staff returning to the buildings for work prior to when teaching begins. Step 2 is virtual instruction provided by McFarland educators, the McFarland virtual plan. It does include in-person supports or VIP supports. And then step 3, and that is how we will begin the school year in the virtual instruction model. Step 3, when public health conditions permit, will be the hybrid or blended learning model, where we're able to have up to 50% of our students in schools at any given time. Half of the students will be having in-person learning, while the other half are having asynchronous learning outside of school, virtual learning, and then the group switch. And so that's set up on a morning and afternoon schedule. Step 4, which will be farther down the road, is full in-person attendance. So all of our students are back in school, and our classes meet in very controlled cohorts of students that don't mix with each other. And this is to prevent limit exposure, and also to make contact tracing in the event of an exposure more manageable for public health department. That's why we keep those kids in groups.
So asynchronous, you said that. So are they going to be that 50%? Are they going to be listening to what the kids are in class?
During the virtual learning period, that's synchronous. Yep. So Arlen's question, if you didn't pick up on the computer, was how does synchronous and asynchronous learning work? So there will be synchronous learning throughout step 2. There will still be some synchronous learning in step 3, but that'll mostly be in person. There will be the learning that's happening virtually outside of when you're not in school with your teacher will be more asynchronous learning. Yep. And then we move to a full in-person attendance for step 4 with cohorts. And then eventually step 5 would be a return to traditional in-person attendance when student cohorts are not required. And we don't anticipate that for some time into the future. I mentioned this at the beginning, and I mentioned this for the last couple of weeks, but just as a reminder that individual buildings may move through these steps at different times through the year for a variety of reasons. And 4K may operate at a different step than K-12 because 4K is covered under different rules by the Public Health Department. 4K is covered by childcare rules. K-12 is covered by school rules, and they are different, and we do have some different opportunities there, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right, so that's the public health update for this evening, and we're going to jump into our 4K update. And the first thing that I want to do is just recap some details from the August 3 board meeting before I hand it over to Brooke Hauser, our associate principal at Conrad Albion Primary School. Last week, we went through quite a bit of detail on what the different learning models will look like at K-12. We talked about how the virtual learning plan will be organized into morning and afternoon live sessions, synchronous sessions, with virtual learning or asynchronous learning happening opposite those times. And then we talked about how that will eventually transition into an in-person hybrid model. And I do want to pause just for a moment because Mr. Mooney's comments are, he is very insightful in looking at encouraging us to look at what an actual classroom looks like. We've actually spent administratively quite a bit of time doing just that over the summer, setting up classroom spaces throughout the district with desks positioned as they would need to be in that hybrid learning model with 6-foot distancing. So we've done quite a bit of that, and we certainly will provide that opportunity for the school board as well as we approach that, scenario. So, but he does raise the same points that we've been struggling with all summer in terms of how do you provide for social emotional learning in a more restrictive environment is quite a challenge. So with that, let me turn it over to Brooke. Welcome, Brooke. Thanks for joining us tonight. And I'll turn it over to her for some more information on 4K.
Great. Thank you so much for having me in today to talk about it.
1 second, Brooke. Let's get your sound going here.
Get that. Could you try again?
That was not Brooke. That was Siri. Sorry.
That's very formal.
There we go. Now I can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you all for your patience and for having me here tonight to talk one more time about how 4K will look in comparison to how we've talked through K-12 at last week's meeting. So as Andrew said, the 4K has different daycare guidelines that we can follow. And we've been doing some planning around how that will look differently. Of course, our youngest learners, these are the very youngest that we have in the school district, and we want to get them back to school as quickly as possible. And our plan right now is to start 4K right away on September 1st, because the numbers are such that we can do that. The precautions are in place such that we can do that. And I'll walk you through the plan to have you understand what planning is in place to make that possible. So we really want to get the kids back to school as quickly as possible, our early childhood kids, as well as our 4K and the K2 students. We talked a lot about that last week and why that's a priority for us. The 4K automatically, like in a normal typical school year, operates on an AM/PM schedule, and it meets 4 days a week. So that's in keeping with what our step 3 hybrid model looks like at the K-12 level. So this year, we're going to do a slight change to that to make the 4K lineup better with our K-12 plan. So we'll be teaching AM/PM on Monday and Tuesday, and on Thursday and Friday. So traditionally 4K has the Friday is their off day of 4K. This year, we're going to switch that to Wednesday being off so that it matches the Wednesday off for the K-12 plan in the hybrid model. So we can go to the next slide, I think. So we've been collaborating with our 4K partners. And just as a reminder, that's Gingerbread House, Little Spartans, and CLM. And we also had to coordinate with transportation needs, district staff, and how that would look. And we've determined that we are safe to operate 4K in person, according to our health data and Dane County Public Health. And we want to do that because we want our kids in school as quickly as we can, but as safely as we can, starting September 1st. So this is a little bit repetitive of what I was just explaining, but Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday will be those 4K days. At K2, for example, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday are our academic days, and Wednesday is a related arts day. 4K will just be off on that day, on the Wednesday, but we are keeping that schedule the same so that transportation can coordinate, so families can coordinate that might have 4K students as well as K-12 students. Because of the numbers that we have, another thing that we need to evaluate is with our K-12 students, and particularly maybe K-5 students, being home virtually learning for this first chunk of the school year, there will be a childcare need in our community for some of those students with wrap care and with daycare opportunities that families will need with their students being online learners for the beginning of the school year. So looking at CLM and Little Spartans, they'll be able to host 4K on their site like they traditionally do, and that won't impact their ability to offer childcare beyond the school day as they typically do. That will work just fine. 4K students can meet there and their childcare kids can meet there as well. But Gingerbread House is a much larger group of kids and has a much larger daycare opportunity with it as well. So this year, their daycare at Gingerbread House will take place at Gingerbread House, and the Gingerbread 4K program will be housed at CEPS. So we'll be opening a few classroom spaces for them to be able to meet in our school building so they can run more like school, so that GBH, Gingerbread House, can operate more like a daycare while they're there. So we have several classroom spaces. We have a second grade classroom that will be empty this year due to the number of model cohorts that we have coming through in second grade. We also will have some rooms that we aren't using for traditional teaching, our STEAM lab, our music room, our art room. Since we're not bringing kids to co-mingle in those spaces, those are spaces that we could set aside also for CEPS. So Greg Nelson and I are working on a plan for exactly which rooms we'll use for those. And we've also made it a priority that we want to make sure that we don't displace any CEPS staff that'll be coming back in either step 1, 2, and 3, so they don't have to do any unnecessary room changing. There'll be rooms available for that without having to displace more people that are already at our building. So to start the year virtually, we'll start virtually K2 and K-12 for that matter, and we'll start 4K in person. As we move through the steps that way, we plan to have 4K in person the whole year. If Dane County Public Health numbers have a huge spike and we are no longer able to meet the needs of those 4K kids in the ratios that are currently in place, we would offer virtual learning to our 4K students. We're hoping we don't have to do that because our trends will continue to move us in forward progress motion. But we are training 4K teachers in our Canvas learning management system, and we're going to make sure that they are ready for an opportunity if we have to step backwards on those timelines and the metrics that we see. One of the things that's been really important over the last several years with 4K, we've really made sure that it's part of our 4K12 system. So one of the things we really took a look at too is we've worked really hard to make that 4K12 and to separate 4K back out as doing something a little bit different again. That was one of the factors we considered with setting up the plan the way we did. But we really feel like getting those 4K kids back to school, as long as transportation, building and grounds, and the staffing can handle it, that's going to be the best way for us to go to meet the needs of those kids. So transportation will work the same for 4K like it will be working for K-12. And this is important for how our families responded to our transportation survey. Just a reminder for you all, and that this will be the same for 4K, that our AM, the busing is available only to school in the morning. And then for the afternoon section, it's available to and from the school. And that's because there's just not quite enough room or space of time in between the pickup to go home from the morning and the pickup from home to come to school in the afternoon to get the buses cleaned to our satisfaction to safety standards. So in the morning, buses will take kids to school, including 4K. In the afternoon, busing will happen to and from school. And that was a big piece of why we needed family members to answer our survey so that we could put kids in the right cohort placements right from the get-go. Even in virtual, we want to make sure that they're still, if they're an AM or a PM, families can count on that being the way it looks if we come back hybrid and when we come back hybrid. So the last couple of things, and then I can take any questions that you have. Family and staff will hear about this plan as of tomorrow, and we will continue to respond to public health data. So if that has to walk us backwards with our 4K plan, we will do that and offer virtual opportunities at 4K, but we're hoping that starting them from the beginning of the year in those smaller class sizes and bringing some of the students on our CPS campus is going to negate the need to have to do that for our little learners. You can just imagine our 4-year-olds trying to stay in front of a computer and access what they need. So they're definitely better off in person if we can do that. We'd also like to thank our 4K partners. We had tours at both Gingerbread House and at CLM. Greg and I took tours along with a couple of staff members, and it was so great to be able to see what they're doing for safety, hand washing, sanitizing, how they handle their toys and cleaning those, how they handle the restroom breaks, how they handle water bottles and drinking fountains. And then to see 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, as well as their school-age kids, all wearing their masks. They weren't fiddling with them. They were comfortable. They just kind of adapt so much easier than sometimes we adults do. So it was really encouraging to see that. And it was a really great opportunity to have what they're doing at 4K help inform what we can do at K2 and beyond. So we are better prepared for the school year once we do have kids in our building. They're already doing it, and they're doing it well. So it was great to be able to see that in action. And then we'll continue to update you about 4K planning and programming at future board meetings as we go forward.
Thank you, Brooke, very much. Questions for Brooke? Christine.
Thanks so much, Brooke, for giving the presentation. I have two kind of, I guess, big questions. One, can you remind us what the public health guidelines are for this age group and how they're different from what we were looking at, for example, for K-12? And then the other question is, if I understand the contract correctly, I guess my question is, who's responsible for making the decision if we were to move in and out of steps? Does that fall on like CLM or does that fall to the district? And what are the plans for that?
Let me jump in if I could on that
Sure.
second part of your question first, Christine.
Sure, thanks.
For 4K follows when we think about closing schools for snow, for example, 4K follows the district in those decisions. So that would be the same here with us. And in terms of, and just to get started on the questions about how do the childcare rules differ from the K-12 rules? Well, one of the first things that's different is the 6-foot spacing rule is not part of the childcare rules. They are governed more by the numbers of students in a room. So there's a maximum of 15 students in a room with the teachers. And so all of our 4K classes are structured that way to begin with, even under normal circumstances. So just a couple things there. Brooke, what else would you share on that?
I guess just as far as our collaboration with 4K, Greg is the principal for 4K as well. So, and each of those sites has a director. So those directors and Greg and sometimes myself meet together sort of like we do with our building leadership teams where we have a representative from each of the grade levels. So that kind of works as an operating, board for the CLM and GBH together with Little Spartans. So that's a way that we're all making sure we're kind of on the same page. So I think that's part of the communication piece that's important to understand, that the directors and Greg meet together on a regular basis to convey the same information so that we're running the same way and under the same rules and understanding what the district plan is.
Ian.
Wait, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
sorry.
I wasn't. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Christine.
So I mean, we've spent like hours. So I don't really want to skip over the public health concern. So you were saying that there's no 6-foot spacing. You have to be less than 15 students, and that's not, so those are both not a problem. What about mask wearing? What about some of the other things that we've been just discussing for making sure the teachers and the kids are safe? What are the rules? Oh, sorry, I'm not done. What are the rules for the public health under the 4K, and how are those once again different than what we've been following for the rest of it?
So many of the, thank you, Christine. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Hold on, I'm getting some feedback here somewhere. And could you maybe turn your speakers off? There we go. Thanks. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I apologize for cutting off there. The biggest thing again is the thing that's different, which I mentioned a moment ago, is the 6-foot spacing and the 15 student class size. The reason that's important is because our kindergarten and older grades are larger, and so we can't have all the students in one room. So I spoke to that a little while ago. As far as cleaning, and I'll get on public health website here in just a moment and then share the screen back that actually shows where all the rules are, and I'll do that in just a moment. But the cleaning procedures are very similar. The masking is very similar. The mask order applies statewide to anybody 5 years old or older. And so, a lot of it looks very, very similar in terms of the day-to-day and cleaning procedures and that sort of thing. The big difference, as I said, is that like, you might wonder, why are we not thinking about having kindergarten in person if we can have 4K in person?
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
It was more about that both, teachers and kids are carriers and receivers of the virus. So what are we going to do to make sure that we, consider that? And I guess thank you for reminding me. I did know that under 5, you don't have to wear a mask, but I would assume then the teachers are going to be wearing masks, correct?
Correct.
And, oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, because it's 4K and they're turning 5, that would just be masks for the 4K programming in general. So
Okay.
that, we wouldn't differentiate between you're not 5 yet and you are 5. And even looking at when we took the tours, most of the 3-year-olds were still wearing masks at those locations. And definitely all the 4 and 5-year-old programming, they were wearing masks and very successly too. So
Yeah.
that was really great to see. And
Yeah.
that way we don't need to differentiate between, if they're off-site or if they're at CEPS. In either case, all 4K students will be wearing masks
Right.
as an expectation.
And that surprised me. I knew that you didn't have to, so I'm glad to hear that the kids are willing and to do that. And I do certainly see it in like the grocery store and stuff, little masks on. But my final, I guess I did want to just, and I'll end. My last question though is, if we were to have an outbreak, for example, in one of those classes, would it be a similar response to everything that Kristen Strong laid out for, telling the group that someone has it and all that? Once again, I don't want to gloss over this stuff. Maybe I'm feeling like it's just assumed, but I think it's really important to be really clear about how that's going to happen.
So if there were to be an outbreak, it's the same reporting that we have for, we report it to Dane County Public Health, and then they kind of take over the planning from there about who to notify and contact tracing and all of that. I think it is important to note that they did have an outbreak. One of the teachers at one of the daycare centers ended up with COVID-19, and it was not spread to any other teachers or any other students in that classroom space, even though they're still sharing some toys and minimize, they're not really doing the 6-foot distancing. They are masking indoors. That was just really reassuring to Greg and I and to those teachers that came along on the tour that, one case did not automatically shut down the whole operation. And you'd think, I guess I would think with all the shared toys and things with the younger kids, it's even, you'd think maybe even more contagious or more difficult to keep everything clean like we will be able to with 10-to-1 ratio in the elementary ages. So that was reassuring to us in seeing that tour.
And I would just add to that, childcare centers have been operating throughout the summer, and some of them even previously, and they have to have very similar procedures that schools do in terms of cohorting students and being prepared to respond to an exposure or an outbreak among either their staff or their students or both. So a lot of that will look very, very similar.
Yeah, and sorry for all the questions. We just have not talked about it at all. So this, it feels a little bit foreign, but at the same time, I'm hearing you say it's pretty similar. So thank you for answering my questions.
Anne, did you have a question? It was answered. Okay, all right. Anne's question was answered in these other discussions. Okay. Craig.
Craig, yeah.
I'm wondering about testing of staff and or students, and included in that testing, I guess, well, testing isn't the right word. Are temperatures being taken? If so, how often is the benchmark for our little ones the same as it is for us? If it's 100 degrees plus, then they're sent home. Below that is okay. Just how are you kind of approaching the during the day kind of health checks that you're going to do it at 4K?
So all of those procedures that we talked about last week apply for 4K as well. We are not doing medical testing on site for the same at 4K for the same reasons that we're not doing that in K-12 that we talked about last time. The expectation is that families will self-monitor and check their children's temperatures before coming to school. And if somebody's not feeling well or sick or has a fever, or one of those circumstances applies, and that they stay home. And so all of that will be exactly the same as what we do K-12.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Brooke?
Thanks very much, Brooke.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One more, Christine. Yep.
Sorry. What will be the options for people who are afraid to send their kids? I'm guessing they just don't send them. I mean, that's kind of the option.
Correct. Right. Unfortunately, we're not set up to be able to provide that level of that many options and run a virtual 4K system simultaneously to an in-person 4K system. We certainly understand that some families may choose not to participate in an in-person 4K, and we respect that. We'll be able, as Brooke mentioned earlier, if public health conditions change and 4K, as would other childcare centers, I would assume, need to close to in-person, then we would begin virtual 4K programming at that time.
Do you think as we open, and I'm just an optimist by at heart, as we open and not go backwards, will there be potential for kids to enroll later in the, like in the middle of the school year, if things are all starting to open? Could they come in at that point?
Are you thinking about maybe somebody that hasn't started, just to make sure I'm understanding the question, somebody who chose not to start 4K at the beginning of the year?
Correct.
Oh, sure. If they're a district resident, certainly.
Yep. Okay.
4K is not a compulsory attendance grade.
Right.
And so there's more flexibility there than there is in some of the later grades. Yep. So we can certainly accommodate that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll move to the next part of the slides. There we go. Okay, so I mentioned earlier, we've received from kind of a consistent thread of questions and an ask from folks across the community who have sent in questions to the FAQ, and also internally for some planning, that it would be really helpful to have some no earlier than dates to be thinking about as we're hopefully, as Christine said, hopefully transitioning sooner rather than later to more in-person instruction. We've already talked tonight about 4K beginning on September 1 as normal. We're gonna, and we talked about this structure a little bit last week as well, but we would, as we phase in, assuming public health conditions allow, we'll begin with our youngest learners. And the reason for that is because our youngest learners need, virtual and remote learning is most challenging in general, speaking in general terms, is most challenging for our youngest learners who are not as accustomed to a remote learning and not as independent in their learning as older students, say in high school. So we'll begin by phasing in from step 2 remote learning to step 3 hybrid in-person learning with grades K2, and we'll do that no sooner than Thursday, September 17th, which is about 2 weeks after school begins. And then if all goes well, we'll follow the next week with grades 3-8. And then as we talked about last week in with the big presentation, the high school is going to stay in the remote learning framework through the end of the first quarter, and we'll transition at the beginning of the second quarter, with the caveat that some of the hands-on classes, some tech ed classes, performing arts, et cetera, some of those classes will transition to in-person sooner than the end of first quarter because they lend themselves better to in-person instruction than virtual instruction. So, yep.
What date is that?
It's the first week of November. Yep. Second quarter begins first week in November. And so that'll be, so this is these are, I want to emphasize, these are the earliest dates that we would be thinking of moving forward. And again, this is contingent upon public health data improving. But we did want to offer some type of, at least a little bit of concrete planning in terms of calendaring here. So you'll notice that unlike some districts that have chosen to say we're going to be all virtual until the end of the first quarter or the end of the first semester, we're still following our framework here in terms of being flexible as we can be in response to public health changing, and still providing 2 weeks notice to families and staff when those steps happen. So the other piece that I wanted to talk about a little bit tonight is staff expectations for step 2. Step 2 again is the remote learning step. We talked about, and also want to clear up, there may be a misconception, limited misconception among the community a little bit about staff being, how we're accommodating staff and childcare needs and such. We have made the accommodation for staff to, if they need to bring their own children to work during step 1, which is before teaching begins. And so staff, if they need to do that, are allowed to bring their own children to school for the planning time and prep time that happens for the week prior to school beginning. However, as we talked about last time, if staff members who choose to do that, their children need to be, staff members need to be able to fully participate professionally in all the activities and maintain confidentiality and all of those sorts of things. So when we move into step 2, when teaching begins, there may be some staff members who, generally speaking, teachers will teach from school, from their classroom. There may be some teachers who for any number of reasons may need to teach remotely to provide their remote teaching from a site other than school, other than their classroom, perhaps from their home, during the virtual learning environment while that's going on. And I just want to emphasize that the expectation for teachers who are working under those circumstances is that the learning environment that they would be creating and providing for their students from a location other than school meets the same professional standards as a learning environment that we would provide from school, which is to say, and that would include, but not limited to the things on the slide here, a private teaching space that is free from distractions, fully reliable technology, and maintaining all district student confidentiality requirements. So there are going to be likely will be some very legitimate reasons why a teacher would need to do that. And we just want to be really clear about what the expectations are up front so that everybody can plan properly. And the bottom line is our students need the same professional learning environment, the quality learning environment, regardless of the space from which the teaching is being offered from, to end a phrase in end of a sentence in a preposition, which I shouldn't do. anyway, that's what this is about. So we're trying to provide, again, trying to provide flexibility for our staff, but also maintain very high standards for our students and community as well. So there we go. So are there any questions about these last two pieces, staff expectations or the no earlier than transition dates that I talked about?
I thought it was a very good presentation for a lot of things. Very good.
Thank you, Arlen. Oh, Craig, yep.
Have you had, I suspect you probably have, had the opportunity to speak to the MFT regarding the, staff expectations for
Yep.
step 2 and
Yep.
because I have a suspicion that there may be some pushback from parents of students whose teacher is caring for children at the same time they're teaching the students, or the perception that a
Mhm.
teacher might be doing childcare at the same time as their professional teaching obligations.
Right.
I suspect that it probably won't be true.
That's
because
correct.
Because I know our teachers and I know our staff, but I suspect there may be pushback in terms of that.
There certainly is a concern that has been expressed by at least a couple of community members who have emailed with concerns about will my child's teacher be caring for their own children while they're teaching? Will they have them with them in the classroom? The answer to that is no. And the same is true with somebody who's teaching remotely from a site other than the classroom. If a teacher is going to teach from a space other than their school classroom, then they need to set that up in a way where their children are not interrupting their teaching and such, just like they would at school. Yeah. And Craig, the answer to your question about communication with MFT, we meet every week, and I've reviewed this framework with them. They're very appreciative of the flexibility that may be afforded to those who need it, and also very understanding that we all have professional standards to maintain as well.
I had assumed
Yep.
nothing but.
Yep. Arlen.
My question is, we don't live in a perfect world.
Mhm.
And so you have a family, you're gonna have some kid that's gonna get ill.
Mhm.
And I don't know what I know what I hear out there is there's a huge shortage of substitutes, and districts are all looking for them because we all have the same problem.
Mhm.
So that teacher can't tend to the kid at all, somebody's got to tend to it. And so there is no latitude for them to do two things at once, even though, and if we have, do we have a shortage of subs, or are we going to be okay?
Well, we'll be to say do we have a shortage of subs? As you said, there's a shortage of subs all over. I mean, we're looking to engage substitutes dedicated to each school and have them booked, if you will, for the year to help with those things.
The reason I
Yeah.
say that is it was on the news,
Mhm.
and what do they call that when we have the subs on call?
Teachers on call.
Teachers on call.
Yep.
And that's a organization or a.
That's the organization we partner with for our guest teachers. Yeah.
And I was having districts looking for their own subs because they
Mhm.
can't guarantee that they have teachers on call can fill it because there isn't enough people with this epidemic, it's quite a draw. So
Right.
they're hiring their own subs so that they have subs regardless.
Yep. And that can be done with teachers on call as well. You can arrange with teachers on call to say this, we'd like to arrange for this guest teacher to be assigned to this building for a week, a month, the entire school year, and just lock that in.
Similar to a retainer kind of.
Yep.
Arrangement you might make with attorney.
So is that what these other school districts are doing though when they lock theirs down?
I don't know what they're doing. Yeah.
I was just curious. I mean, if it was
Yeah.
on the news, it's happening, and it may not be happening in Dane County,
Yeah.
but it, wherever there is a shortage of having good subs.
It's true.
And
Yeah.
and in the event that happens, I mean, what do we do if we have a teacher, if we don't have a sub? And a teacher has their kid is sick, they can teach from home, but they can't because we can't have that distraction.
Well, and if a teacher has, or any staff member for that matter, not just a teacher,
Oh, I understand.
if any staff member has, an illness, you're giving an example of an illness, if a staff member becomes ill herself or himself, or has an ill family member whom they need to take care of, then they're able to take sick time for that, and we
Yeah.
arrange for a substitute.
I get that. I was just didn't know if maybe I'm overlooking, but I was kind of surprised to hear it on the news that way. I know we've had some questions in the past, or staff has asked questions in the past.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to make sure that
So
it might be a pretty good bump in the road, even though we have a bunch of people that have retired.
Yep.
But then again, they're usually senior teachers that are
They're-
more vulnerable.
Correct.
So rather than having them coming back, they're kind of backing up a little bit
Yeah.
because they're older.
they might be in a higher risk
Yes,
group.
exactly right.
Yep.
And they're pros, they can step in the classroom and be comfortable.
Right.
So that's what
Yep. That will be a challenge for us. I mean, there's no question that and that's why we're trying to be proactive on it on the front. Okay, so those are my updates for this evening. And just to recap, we will be starting 4K on September 1, just like we would in a normal school year. And the reasons again being that the public health conditions permit that, and the rules for 4K permit that under current public health conditions. We've got our phased in no earlier than dates for K2, 3, 8 in the high school. And then we've got some clarification on staff expectations for a teacher or teachers who may, they would have to have the approval of the school district, of course, but that may need to teach remotely from a site other than the classroom.
I think everybody sounds pretty comfortable. That sounds right. Anybody got any concerns?
This is not really a concern, but it would fall under the other updates category here. In the past at the high school, when we have advanced placement classes, students often were given assignments to work on over the summer. Given that we're already near the middle of August, do you know if anything like that is in the works for high school students, or?
I'm not aware myself, but Melissa may be able to provide us some information on that. And I see she's on the call this evening, so we'll invite her to answer that. And if she doesn't have an answer, we will find out and get back to you.
Because I have heard from parents and about their students in advanced placement classes and how that's going to work this year.
Hi. Hello. I do not have any specific information for you. Typically, that information is shared directly from the teachers to the students who are enrolled in the class. And I wonder if part of the reason in the delay in that communication this summer is because the schedule, I believe they're done building the schedule at the high school now, but that process was much delayed with determining how we would open school and how the schedule would work. But once we know which students are enrolled in those advanced placement classes, I would imagine that the teachers will reach out directly to those students and get them the materials they need to prepare.
Christine.
This is back to the topic you had asked if all of us were okay with all of this. I don't think there isn't a vote being taken tonight. Is that correct?
No, I was just asking.
Okay. Okay. Then I just wanted just a clarification though. I can't remember if it was, I think it might have been you, Andrew, who ended it by saying with the staff expectations with approval from the district. Has that changed from the last time we met? Because that wasn't an expectation, or
No,
it's more like just let the building administration know, basically.
It's the same thing as we said last time in terms of if you have unique circumstances that we need to work with you on, you need to communicate that with the principal, and we make those arrangements.
Okay, so it's not like at a district level where they have to fill out a form and you have to approve it, and so that's all stayed the same. Okay, gotcha.
It's really about communication and making sure
Sure.
everybody's understanding what the needs are.
Absolutely.
Through it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. You bet. Thanks for the question. Okay, so that's all I have for this evening.
Nice job, everybody. Now I look for a motion to go into closed session under state statute 1985 1C.
So moved.
Craig?
I'll second.
And thank you.
All right, this is a roll call vote. So, Erlen,
Yes.
Craig,
Yeah.
Christine,
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
5-0.
Okay, we're in full session at 8:54, you recall.
Okay, and if we could
Oh,
pause,
7:54, excuse my,
there you go, yep.
7:54.
If we could pause for just a moment, I'm going to touch base with Mr. Pennicamp and just make sure that we are change the technology to accommodate our closed session. So
Okay. Thanks, everybody.